told by an elder, and in this case, the elder is a woman. So the sort of unique point of view of the story is it's a female point of view written by me. So why would I do such a thing? Well, at the time I started writing this, I was helping to raise a teenage girl. My mother had just lost her husband, and I was very close to her. And for some reason, I have spent a lot of time with elders and a lot of time with women. So I've seen a lot of those elders to the exit, and they've often said to me that they have one last story to tell, and that was true for both my mother and my father. So this part of this story was inspired by something that each of my parents said to me as sort of as they were on the way out. So I'm just going to read a couple different sections from this book to try to give you a flavor of what goes on. It's set in 1926. Prohibition is in full swing. It, just as a little review, Prohibition starts in 1920 and ends in 1933. And it comes in with the 18th Amendment, which is quickly followed 7 months later by the 19th Amendment, which gives women the right to vote. And women were instrumental in both pushing prohibition forward and also getting the right to vote, because it was the belief that if they were going to throw the brakes on alcoholism and the men not spending all their money when from their paychecks on Friday, they had to do something about drinking. But in order to do that, they had to get the right to vote. That was sort of an upside story for women. The downside to that is that organized crime did not really exist in America before Prohibition. So the mafia and all of the organized crime gangs that really came into play started in around that same period. Ironically, at the same time of Planned Parenthood. So all of these things were happening simultaneously. So it was a time in history that always interested me. The other piece, of course, is there's been an alcoholic gene in my family from as far back as we can trace. 16 people have either died or succumbed to alcoholism. And I've had my own struggles with that earlier in my life. So I've always been interested in trying to find sort of new ways to talk about that. So this is a story that's set in that period. So we begin here with this elder Norah recalling a time when she's 14 years old on Lake Erie in a small town called Rye Beach, which is right close to Sandusky on Lake Erie. So turn back the clock a little bit. You can reach only so far into the cloud that anyone is, and then that cloud travels on without you. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still feel the sway of the porch swing in the leeway between dusk and dark, when the failing light is reluctant to lay down its truss. Daddy and I are sitting next to each other, speaking in low tones, careful that Mama is out of earshot. The upward notch of the swing is followed by the backward creak, reminding me that Lake Erie is forever heaving itself on Rye Beach, then pulling back, always close and far away. I can hear again Daddy telling me about the one thing he and I shared. He called it our demon switch. He said if you weren't born with the hidden fuse, you couldn't ever get it, no matter if you walked on your hands or ate steak and eggs every morning. The womb gave you the demon switch. Only the grave could take it back. Do I have it, this switch? No question about it, he said, gripping my shoulders like he wanted me to know the full burden of my strength and brokenness. How does this demon go about its work? When everything else breaks down, the demon in you takes charge. What do you mean? Remember when that toddler fell into the lagoon and he sank like a stone? You and I were out taking a walk. You couldn't have been more than 10 or 11. I was looking out at the lake when it happened, and I didn't even see the boy. The parents screamed, no one could think, but you didn't need to. I've tried to forget that day, I said. You dove into the water beside the breakwater, with the waves pounding the rocks, and somehow, Norah Bow, you brought that boy back. The father and mother looked at you like you were both an angel and a devil for doing something they couldn't imagine being done in this life. They thanked you many times, but they walked away from you faster than you could dry yourself off. Remember that? Are you saying the parents of that boy thought I was... It scared them to be in your presence, even though they wept with joy at the return of their son. They thought you were a wild animal, not of this world. I'm also saying you've known about this demon switch all your life, that you're different from other girls. And you have this demon, Daddy? Top dead center, he said, drawing the heel of his right hand across his forehead like he was taking aim on a stubborn crease. How come I've never seen it? Daddy didn't answer me as we rocked on the porch swing watching fireflies gin up holes in the dark. He gave me his answer on another night when I saw his demon change roles with the man I loved. I guess you could say most of my life has been about talking to my demons and angels. But for decades, I believed only my father was given to such spirited confessions in this land of bones and unbelief. Vigil and verse reading have shown me otherwise. No matter how pretty we talk or how little we sulk, no one I've ever met is unfamiliar with the gates of the netherworld, and few in my wake have refused the help of a warrior angel. Even if you don't cotton to the Bible, you have to admit there are some lines in there so riddled with the wild, dark flame, they can't be lit any better. Like this one from Psalm 141, "Let the wicked fall into their own nets, while I alone escape." That one verse peppers my blood and wings me back to the summer of 1926 when I was 14 and I went after Daddy, who'd been kidnapped by rum runners on Lake Erie. Just to be clear, my going after him was not about serving justice or making sure my brothers had a father or even about trying to assuage Mama's tears. No, my need to retrieve him was more fierce and elemental, like some message staunch writ on the tablet of my soul. Daddy never took counsel from an angel, never for one day believed in God's legion, but he did believe in me. For that reason alone, I wasn't about to quit on him, because if I did, it would be like quitting on my own dream of a sailing life. The second reason was more like a sack of pig iron. I believed I was to blame for his being taken at gunpoint. Because I don't sleep much anymore. I have the night's long middle to tell you how my Lake Erie net was cast long ago. Or was it yesterday, when the light and dark strands fell around me, and I could do nothing more than set forth into a quadrant of great unsettling. So that's Norah's kind of initial meditation, reflection on the story she's about to tell. So I'm going to jump around here. I would love in some way to read that whole first chapter to you, but I'm going to jump now to when she's now a few days after she saw her father on a beach with 3 men who were unloading crates of whiskey, and she and her dog Bob had discovered them, and she's fundamentally at great loss to sort of even eat or sleep. She's completely distraught about what she's seen, because among other things, her father has always claimed he's a teetotaler. So now she's at Sunday dinner with him. I sat to Daddy's right, close enough to brush the back of his hand. His jaw bulged while he tapped his right foot. His whole body twitched and flexed like a hoisted sail fresh out of wind. I extended my fingers and wrapped them around his. He smiled, surprised at my reach, and nodded like maybe he knew I sensed the full measure of his discomfiture. Our eyes worked out some code of hope and confusion. In that one shared moment, I felt shiny new and old as dirt, all at the same time. I squeezed harder, and he squeezed back. I thought, Daddy is still here. That's all that matters. Everyone leaned in the table, eager to dig into Mama's food, and everyone was temporarily frozen, suspended, waiting for Daddy to begin. I could hear the breathing of the table, the licking of lips, the scraping of chairs, the men loosening their belts, and Aunt Cora running her hands through her hair and smacking her tongue against the back of her teeth like she was sucking hard candy. One blue bottle fly with orange eyes as big as headlights circled the table like it was aiming to return to the source of some animal remains that had spawned it. Daddy picked up his knife and fork, and that prompted a creaking in the sashes and a rattle of window glass. The cottage door burst open, and 3 candles strung along the length of the table all bent down their flames. One blew out. 3 men in long coats and bandanas over their mouths poured across the threshold like a sheet of burning oil. Aunt Cora dropped her hands against her plate. Her fat ear of unbuttered corn cartwheeled off the table and hit the floor like a cannonball. Uncle Bill muttered, "What the hell?" One of the men conked Uncle Bill with the butt of his gun. Bill slumped and fell out of his chair, blood gushing from his forehead. A moan trickled out of my uncle's chest. The man in the middle whipped out a black sash and cinched it over Daddy's head. The man held a gun to the black sack covering Daddy's head. I looked at the head in the black sack. I didn't hear a sound from him. The gunman said, "If anyone screams, I'll pull the trigger and scat his brains inside this bag, eh?" Mama's face turned white as the butter dish. Her eyes spun in her head before she fainted, which made the man holding the gun to Daddy's head twitch his ears like a roadside rabbit. I studied the men for height and build, clothing, shoes, anything I might use to recognize them in some other place at another time. The man on the left was bald and stocky and a beard bulging from under his bandana. The man in the middle was a spoon over 6 feet. His thin, calloused hands hung at his sides. His middle index nail was swollen black. The rest of them were cracked and jagged. The man on the right had a ropey gut. He made a 2-footed hop like a roadside crow guarding a kill. He was the one who scared me the most. I was glad I'd left Bob in Mama's room. It flipped my stomach to think of him lunging at the gunman and getting himself shot up full of holes. I blinked once, maybe twice, and the men poured out of the house as fast as they had come in, the smell and stain of them lingering like a foul gas. No one knew what to say. They stared at the front door like maybe Daddy would return on his own accord. I knew better. I ran outside. Mama called, "Norah, Bo, get back in here." I looked out into the night, wet my finger to feel the wind and the hole those men had slipped through. I backed myself into the cottage knowing I had to tell everyone what I had seen on the beach. "Those rum runners took Daddy to Canada," I whispered. "We've got to follow them." "They have guns," Mama squawked. "Don't care what they have," I said, rushing toward the door, but Aunt Cora blocked my path. "You can't do that," Aunt Cora shouted. "You're just a..." I tried to push Aunt Cora aside, but she threw her whole weight against me, and I sputtered sideways and collided with the dry sink. Uncle Bill pulled himself off the floor, pressing one hand against the gash in his head. Blood and all, he had the clarity of mind to reach for the telephone on the wall and ring the sheriff. "It's my fault," I blurted out. "What are you saying?" Uncle Bill asked. "I saw Daddy on the beach and..." "We're all upset, Norah, but now is not the time to..." my uncle said. "Let me tell you what..." "Not now," Aunt Cora said. "We have to figure out what to say." "What do you mean? What are we going to tell the sheriff and the neighbors?" "You're worried about the neighbors?" "Norah," Mama called out, "for once can you hold your tongue?" One long hour passed after Uncle Bill rang up Sheriff Kelly, and he came over to our cottage. The sheriff was an imposing figure, but not in a way you could lean into. So much sweat poured off his forehead you'd think he was smoking. He was stoking a train. He had a gut you'd need to carry in a wheelbarrow. Before any of us could say anything, he asked for a glass of water and killed it in 2 gulps. "Do you know who took him?" he asked, wiping his brow with his forearm. "Rum runners for Canada," I piped up. The sheriff held out his glass to Aunt Cora for a refill. How do you know this? I could smell their breath and the engine oil on their clothes, I said. The gunman rounded his O's, flattened his A's, and finished his sentence with A. The sheriff smiled weakly, like he should have known to ask about the sounds and smells the men brought with them. You might be right, Norah Bow. I know I'm right. Those three men plucked Daddy right out of our paradise, and they meant him no good. When the full force of this crime hit me, a terrible loneliness ran over me because I knew this kidnapping was my fault. I didn't say a word to anyone about what I saw on the beach, but the three men must have figured I would. They came back to make sure it didn't matter what I said. Sheriff Kelly said no man had ever before been abducted from Rye Beach. He looked lost when he said this, like maybe we should scotch our story and replace it with some other version. I figured whatever chance we had to follow the three rum runners was nearly gone. They were probably speeding back to Canada and Daddy knocked out, bleeding, or already dead. I got madder and madder just watching our dim-witted sheriff puzzle out the obvious coordinates. If those men took Vital to Canada, I've got no jurisdiction there. That's no excuse, I said. Everyone knows you get seasick just looking at the water. Norah, that's enough, Mama said, her voice more of a whimper than a command. With each passing minute, I knew it was up to me to bring Daddy home because our sheriff had no intention of going to Canada to fetch him. Best our sheriff would do would be to get a story on the front page of the Sandusky Daily Register. Daddy would get some ink, but that wouldn't bring him back from the green-black swells of Erie. From early on, I remember Daddy telling me, there's nothing you can't do when you're sailing on Lake Erie, Norah Bow. When everyone else is afraid of storms, you stand strong. You are the bow of the world. When he first said this to me, I smiled because he was making a play on our name, spelled the same way as the word that means the front end of a boat, the bow. Why did Daddy have to call me the bow of the world, like he was singling me out now to go bring him back from some unnamed torment? Why did three men hauling my Daddy away with a black bag over his head make me feel like I was already dead, but never more alive? I don't like to swear, but goddamn tomorrow and send it back to running fire. But these men, whoever they were, would not get away with this crime. Even if Daddy had brought this on himself, I still believed in him, the way he believed in my legs. You will walk again, Norah Bow. Uncle Bill and Aunt Cora and even a few noisy neighbors eventually cleared off, all shaking their heads, some crying, some pledging to return in the morning, some saying they would help find Daddy. I knew better. They would all talk themselves into a corner while they nursed a cup of coffee. But they would never make a move because all of them, like the sheriff, were mostly afraid of Lake Erie and the thin men who knew how to zigzag across it with hooch from Canada. So that's the end of the first chapter. Her father, Vital Bow, has been, she uses the word kidnap, but of course he's really abducted, but in her mind it's kidnapping. So Norah, she and her father had built a boat together, and she leaves in the middle of the night by herself to go find out what happened to her father and to retrieve him from wherever he's been taken to. So her boat is called the Odyssey, and she sets off on an odyssey by herself. And but in all good stories of this nature, she needs a mentor, a companion, a guide, and she finds an older woman adrift in a dinghy, not far from where she leaves Rye Beach. So I'm just going to give you a little taste of her guide on this odyssey to retrieve her father. With the steady southwesterly wind, I thought I could make Pelee Island on a single tack. I cracked the sheets just so I could feel the wind in my left hand, like a living flame drawing me out of the dark pocket I'd left behind. In my tiller hand, I felt the long pull of Erie as she ran up deeper and wider, the occasional crack of a wave on my port side, reminding me not to nod off. The moon was so close, no matter how I steered, it held me in the fold of its track. I couldn't fashion into a constellation what I planned to do once I got to Pelee Island, but that didn't stop me from letting the wind tickle my backbone. I settled in for the night reach to Pelee, when I saw about 20 degrees off to port what appeared to be a dinghy aimlessly adrift from its owner and destination. I put the binoculars on the ghostly rig and saw what looked like a frayed coat dangling from a carnival ride. I would have been happy to retrieve such a boat under any other circumstances with the thought I might be able to sell her. But that night I had no business doing salvage as I had done on other occasions. Still, I had to honor the seafaring obligation and find out if someone was on board and needed help. Early on, Daddy told me you never turn your back on a boat in distress because you never know when that boat might be your own. I pointed upwind as high as Odyssey could go, then flopped so I could run alongside this moon-drenched craft catching air with a drape of cloth. Even from a distance, I could see the boat was no piece of junk. It made me sick to think I couldn't tow the smartly lap-straight boat and convert her to sail. I saw a woman, legs propped on the gunwale, the wind billowing her dress and turning it into a miniature sail. "Ahoy there," I called out. I repeated my greeting, flinching some when I did so, thinking this time the woman might be dead and I would be bound to haul her with me and make her death known. As I jibed, a tousled head of red hair fell inside a vein of moonlight. The woman was just as surprised to see me as I was to see her. Both of us slack-jawed. We said nothing, but stared after each other like we'd never seen another living, breathing female before. I jibed again, aiming to find the right tack to drift down on her without bringing harm to either craft. Something had gone very wrong, and there was no telling what that was. "What are you doing out here?" I shouted. "Might ask the same of you," the woman said. I came into the wind not 2 yards from the craft and lowered sail. "Grab a line," I said. The red-headed woman reached out and caught the line. With her arms outstretched, I saw that she wore a silver-beaded flapper dress, low-cut in the front, the hem torn away and blackened from smoke. Her kiss-curled hair didn't cover the bruises on her face. Her left ear was puffed out like a water balloon. I wondered if this once fancy woman sprung from a fire might be a ghost, invisible to all in this life, but to me, who had fished her out of my own unspoken need for crew. "I've got no fenders, so we can't raft up," I said. The woman reached out and drew my boat closer. As she pulled, I had a notion to hoist sail and veer away, because there was no way of knowing whether she would offer me more muscle or mischief than I already had. She had heft on me and looked as if she could cast me overboard, take my boat. She read my thin smile. "I mean you no harm," she said, her eyeballs burning into me. "You didn't answer my question," I said, grabbing the paddle. I was knocked on the head and set adrift by the captain of a fishing boat called the Purple Goose. "Why do you do such a thing?" "Need to ask him," she said. Something about the way she said this rang true, but maybe this was not the first time she'd found herself keeping time with an agitated man. Moonlight caught the silver beads on her dress as she talked, and it made her skin look like a living thing. The shimmer made me want to look at her more and look away, so I wouldn't be blinded. "When I come alongside, I'll steady the boat so you can step into the center of my boat." "Sounds easy enough," she said. "One more thing," I said. "You can't bring anything with you." "I've got a traveling bag," the woman said. "What's in it?" "Just a few necessities." "Guess so," I said. The woman looked into the green heave of Lake Erie and sighed, the relief on her face more visible than the moonlight. As the two boats nudged and bounced, I pulled her dinghy toward me with my paddle. So the woman that she meets there is, her name is Ruby Francoeur, and she is not who she appears to be, but they become companions on this voyage, which takes them to Pelee Island, and then to Detroit, and then to Windsor, Canada, and into the thick of the whiskey trade across the Detroit River. Just to give you an idea of that, about how profitable that was, Al Capone, who you're all familiar with, was making about $100 million a year in this business, which is the equivalent of about $1.5 billion in today's dollars. So he did that for pretty much the entire length, and he was just one of many, many players, including the Kennedys. So, at any rate, that's my little introduction to Norah Both. Thank you so much for listening.
Jay, it was wonderful listening to you read there. I love the book, and I would say one thing I really liked about it was is in the title. It's called The Last Tale of Norah. And you have to understand, I think, this is my interpretation, that this is a retold story. And our memories are not perfect after 60, 70 years, whenever it's being told. And I love the, what I'll call the fantastical quality in this book. The fantastical texture. It's obviously a quest. The name of the boat is the Odyssey. It doesn't take this 14-year-old girl, spirited girl, 10 years like it did Odysseus to get back from the Trojan Wars, but takes her 6 weeks, I believe. And she runs into these adventures that are, well, improbable. I mean, are you really going to run into, in the middle of the night, a dinghy with a woman with a cocktail dress? Highly unlikely, but that's what makes the story great, I think. And there are other things. There are epic storms that she will encounter on Lake Erie. There are rum runners, of course, dangerous men. And there's even a swarm of mayflies that threaten to, not locusts, but mayflies that threaten to blind her. And so I think that all of these episodes really add to the drama of the book. They may be exaggerated in retelling of it, I don't know. But that's part of the mystery of the book that I really like. There are also realistic moments in the book, and I'm immediately reminded of Charles Portis's book, True Grit. And this is the story, the original movie I think was made in 1969, the John Wayne movie. And you remember the 14-year-old girl, Maddie Ross, whose father has been murdered by this guy. What's his name?
I forget who
Yeah. Anyway, this reminded me of that, and so I'm wondering, was True Grit a sort of model for this book, and were there other models, and were there real life models for the characters in this book and the story?
Yeah, absolutely love True Grit. I mean, both the movies and the remake with Jeff Bridges and the John Wayne. But the story, I mean, the book is phenomenal. The book is even better than
Can you
the
hear
movie.
Jay? No?
Yes.
Okay.
The book is even better than the movie. But what I think I like best is, of course, an improbable young person, and saying, well, everybody's telling me I can't do something, and I'm going to do something. That's what that character does, and that's what Norah does. I mean, the sheriff in this story says, well, we have no jurisdiction to go after your father. And she feels responsible for what's happened, and so she decides to go after him. How can she do this? Well, she's got the demon switch. She's got the thing that her father has, but she has it in reverse. So where he is sort of, in some ways, disempowered by his demons, she's empowered. And so I wanted to really create somebody who could do these impossible things, seemingly impossible things, But as we know, I mean, young people are just as capable as old people in terms of doing things. We count them out, but why don't we count them in? Because they do incredible things all the time. I mean, we can read stories about people that, and you know, or people who stop and help somebody that looks like they need help, and nobody else is stopping. Young people do that, old people do that. Anyway, in terms of my own life, I was hoping this story in some way would help empower my own daughter, my own teenage daughter, who I was struggling to sort of understand in many ways. And I wanted to say to her indirectly, you can do anything. There's nothing you can't do, including completely take a turn or a tack that nobody else is going to approve of.
This, I will hold up my own book, which you can buy unsigned, and I want to say that my biggest thought about, my biggest vulnerability, I think, in writing this book, looking back at it, was female character. And I had just a tough time writing the female lead in this book, and I'm wondering, you talked a little bit about that early on, but did you find difficulty?
Well, I have 3 sisters. I was the baby. I currently now have 5 daughters.
I guess that pretty much answers the
And
question.
my mother was, you know, perhaps my closest friend. We talked twice a week, every week, and she always answered the phone the same way. How's my friend today? Okay. So, you know, we had a certain kind of simpatico, and, you know, I spent the last month of her life with her in her own apartment. And and I did this also with my father, and that's where this last tale occurs. So my father told me of his last tale. My mother, in some ways, had told her last tale over a much longer period of time. But I think I always felt closer to the female sensibility my whole life. And so I thought, well, why not do something really difficult, try to write from that persona completely. So,
Tell me a little bit about your research. It seems like you must have been to Pele Island, you must have been to Windsor and Detroit, you must have sailed on Lake Erie, you found out a lot about Prohibition, I think. What was the process like?
well, just what you just said. I spent, I grew up, I spent every summer of my childhood on Lake Erie sailing. My father was a boat builder and sailor. And then for researching the book, I took a plane, a small plane, over all these islands, flew over these islands, went to Pele Island, spent time in Pele, spent time in Detroit, spent time in Windsor. I'd been there to all of these places as a young person, but many times. So I felt like I knew the lake really well, and I just wanted to get reacquainted with everything. Windsor was really the biggest eye-opener because I was able to actually talk to the archivist of like the Hiram Walker whiskey company and learned about things that I don't think they really wanted me to know, but he basically said, you know, you can't ever divulge this information. But essentially, many of the public works in Windsor are paid for with, you know, illegal profits from because all of Canada, of particularly Ontario and Detroit, they just turned a blind eye to this trade. And that's really how all of these boats could leave. And they would actually leave Windsor, come over to Detroit, fuel, and then they would leave and for all parts of the world. And, you know, the Coast Guard and various other entities were saying that they were monitoring all this, but they were either paid off or they would look the other way, because that's the only way that sort of billions of dollars, you know, could through illicit trade.
In just a few words, he he describes this in the book really effectively. They land on a shore in Detroit, they're looking for a hospital. They encounter a policeman, and Ruby asks him if there's a hotel close by that would be cheap enough and, you know, that would actually put these people up. And the cop says, yeah, 2 blocks down here, there's a speakeasy, and then behind there, they've got some rooms. They'll even put you up. So that pretty much tells about the cops' attitudes.
Well, there were something like 10,000 speakeasies in New York City. And, you know, so all of this that was happening was really a big promotion for organized crime. Because so there's a parallel with, say, what happened in the 80s with cocaine in Miami when I was living down there. It was something like, at one point, the number was thrown out, $100 million a day in cash was coming in to Miami from the drug trade. Okay? Sounds like a lot. But I also got involved in the drug trade. And on a border, sort of, in my first novel, I explore that. I mean, as a high schooler, I was offered $100,000 to go out and meet a boat in the Gulf Stream because I knew how to operate boats and go out there, and it was cash. So $100,000 50 years ago was probably worth it.
How'd you spend it?
I didn't take it. But at any rate, I mean, this has sort of always going on, but there's just parallels with that time. But the significance is that the sort of crime world that we live in today was really given birth during Prohibition.
Talk a little bit, if you would, about the relationship between Norah and Ruby, this helper, this guide, this woman in the sequin dress.
Well, she's roughly twice Norah's age, a late 20-something, and she has made her living in the speakeasy world, and as both a card shark and somebody who operates with great ease and ingenuity in these sorts of illicit worlds. And she's had a lot of trouble. She's met up with a lot of trouble, and she's tried to exploit a lot of trouble to her advantage. And so she's a very mixed character for Norah, and but she also, in some way, looks out for her.
Yeah, the contrast between those two characters, I think you'll really enjoy. Talk a little bit, if you would, also about the relationship between Norah and her father.
Well, that's pretty complicated, because, again, there's this great gap between, I mean, I think for all of us, right, we recognize that there's a gap between people's walk and talk, or between appearance and reality. The appearance of her father is that he's wildly supportive. He helps her build this boat that's this really seaworthy craft. He teaches her about Lake Erie, about sailing. And she feels very close to him because he's been such an ally to her dreams. At the same time, he's leading a secret life, a double life, maybe a triple life, that she knows nothing about until this night that occurs. And so then there's a kind of revealing that occurs rather quickly when he's abducted, and she recognizes that the man that she loves, that she's close to, that, you know, who he is not all that he appears to be, that he's really something else. And that, so part of what she's in this journey to recover, it's also a journey to discover who he really is.
How about some questions from all of you?
Yeah. This is not about gender. Because your identification with Norah, and I have not read the book because I can't read small print. I bought it on Kindle today, and it came out on Kindle.
I can get you a large print edition.
What?
I can probably find a large print edition for you.
Really? Oh, Bill, you're lying to me. I can't. Okay, but there's something you said that Norah isn't like most other girls. Because, I mean, and my ears went up when I heard this. She's braver and will take more on than one would expect. And I heard that and a bell went off because I thought, all right, here's somebody who, when confronted with any kind of, you can't, would respond with, hold my beer. That, I mean, you and Norah, there is a daring that one path crosses another as you write that character. And it is your daring and her daring that find its way together. Because
I don't have half as much moxie as Norah does.
bullshit.
But I will say that I've done a lot of solo sailing, and I've done a lot of solo sailing when it was not advised. And so that part of it, I would see a similarity. And frankly, there's something that happens in any solo adventure for anyone at any age that's unlike any other adventure. Because you see things, hear things, do things differently when you're forced to do everything by yourself. You know, artists and writers know this because they spend so much time alone, and they're always taking risks. They're always sort of going out on some thin, high branch and think, oh my God, how did I get out here? Well, now that I'm out here, I better do something. And so, you know, there's parallels with the artistic life, but you know, and also, but anybody who does a solo thing is taking a big chance in a way because they have to rely upon themselves. And Norah is so. I mean, Steve said something really interesting about this memory piece because later on in the book, you know, she really addresses the fact, well, I may be inventing some of this. I don't know if I'm recalling all of this exactly the way it happened.
How unique.
What's that?
Unique.
How unique that we look back in
Right.
our lives and invent things that happen.
Well, and so,
I just never heard of that before.
yeah, well, I mean, you know, the brain science piece is that every time we retrieve a memory, even the same memory, we retrieve it slightly differently.
Well, of course.
Right. So she is doing all of this as well, and so even as the story goes on, she's changing bits and pieces of it
So-
as her mood changes and her reflection changes.
So, take me into the area of belief now. What in the story that you're telling do we believe, and what are we free to ask questions about?
You mean of the character?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, you know, is her sadness genuine? Is her anger genuine? All of those things. I mean, is this something that, you know, is this confession of hers something that we can enter into
Yeah.
as if it were happening to ourselves? Because again, I fully believe that, you know, I'm not a Catholic by any means, but I do feel that notion of confession or revelation, self-revelation, is really important to all of us. And she certainly feels that way, like she has to get this story out before she dies. This is not optional.
Got it.
Jay, is
So-
there a character in the book that she's
Thank
telling
you.
the story to, or is she just telling it to you, the reader?
Telling it to the reader, yeah. I mean, and not unlike the way somebody who's dying is sort of just speaking to the room. There might be somebody in the room with the dying person, but they're sort of in that limbo land and of liminal space where they kind of don't know where they are, they don't know who's there, and they're just kind of speaking to the room and almost everything that's happened to them in their life. So that's kind of what my intention was, is that it's a more general you. Yeah.
Okay, a couple things. One is I love the structure of the book as you described it. It's a great idea to, you know, the way you set it up, and also the tales coming from your two parents who were speaking to the room. Just really intriguing as a way to get started and then to move forward with this novel.
Yeah.
Wonderful ideas. But I can't help but ask you to go back to what you said about your daughter,
Yeah.
and that you were writing it partly for her to believe in herself that she could do anything. And I have a sort of sub-question about that, which is, did she look at the manuscript while you were writing it? Did she say, Dad, women don't
No.
talk like that?
As we know with our children, you know, I tried to get Vera to do sailing lessons. I took her out on my boat, and sailing was not for her. And I would sort of tell her about this character and she would go, oh, that's kind of interesting, and then we'd go off into the next
Well,
kind of.
does she believe she can do anything?
You know, she was, as you
Has
know.
she read the book?
She has read the book.
Okay.
As you know, I mean, she's adopted from Russia. Her intro into coming back here was a 24-hour flight for which she was awake the entire time. And she was just sort of almost on fire. She had this sort of electricity about her, like she was so excited to be traveling. And she is a traveler, so she just sort of did this, you know, mostly solo trip to the Dolomites and wants to go back. And she's an expert at sort of self-navigation. She can figure out any train schedule, any bus, plop her in any country, you know, so she figures stuff out. So she's kind of a pretty good navigator. So in an odd sort of way, she became sort of a sailor of a different sort.
Well, it's interesting you use solo for both of you. That you're a solo, and she's done these solo, and yet, as in your version of being solo, that you wanted to speak across the miles to this daughter, the generation and everything else, the
Yeah.
gender, etc., to let her know in her solo world that she can do anything. That's
Yeah.
a beautiful daughter-father story right there.
Yeah. You know, and just, you know, just as there's any falling off in intention, you still have the original intention. You know, that was the starting point. It didn't quite round the track the way that I imagined it would, but it still had those elements as
Well,
part.
the book tells you what it needs to be.
Yeah, that's, you said it better than I did.
Jim, can I ask you a question about
Yeah.
technique? What are your writing habits?
Oh, you don't wanna know.
The reason I ask is that I'm a really bad habit writer. It took me 9 years to write this fiction book, and to have the courage to actually write it, I had to put some real events in there, because I'd spent my whole life writing newspaper and magazine stories that were as real as I could make them.
Yeah.
And then suddenly I had to write fiction, and I was intimidated as hell, and I needed some real stuff. And that's one of the reasons it took me such a long time. What are your, you know, you talk to, quote, real writers, in my view, you know, and they get up at 5 a.m. and they write until 9, and then they, you know, is that the way you live your life?
Well, my dear friend Jim Moore back here will attest to this. I get up at 5:30 every day, 7 days a week, and I write for about an hour and a half. And then and that's poetry, I write in the morning, and then I do prose later. And I try to write every day, and again, Jim really, many years ago, he said, look, 75% of the stuff you write is probably not gonna be a keeper, but, you know, so you're gonna have to write 90, so you're gonna have to write a lot of stuff, and then you can distill all this, and then you'll have some gems out of that. So, I mean, that really helped me to sort of get into a discipline about, because it is a daily practice. I think, for me, if you're serious, you have to just stay with it, because it's not gonna be all that good. So you're gonna have to write a lot, and then, you know, burn off the dross and see what remains.
How did you handle the idea of chapters? Did you, I was coached by my son, who's a screenwriter, to kind of try and make every chapter compelling to the next chapter, did you think about that, or how did you divide, how did you?
There's more of a kind of a reflective coda at the end of each chapter where the elder Norah is commenting on the younger Norah. So there's a kind of this dual lens going on, because I really wanted the reader to imagine that there was a sort of a parallel world going on between the elder and the young. I mean, the way we all do, I mean, because we can all remember like when we're 3 or 4 or 5, and now we're, you know, much older, but it's this weird thing where the simultaneity of time is sort of always with us. We just think of it and imagine it differently every time we pull it up. So I wanted that, because I'm fascinated by memory and how it both helps and hurts us. And so I wanted that process to be part of the actual chapter, so that it's pretty easy to determine where a chapter is, because the older Norah's going to come back and say, oh, I don't know what the hell I was thinking there. I mean, what was I imagining? That I could walk into this bar by myself and get a job, and I'm only 14? You know.
So Jerry and I were talking, and we were wondering about your process for the story. I mean, did you have like this arc of a story and a character, and then how did it unfold for you as you got into it?
Was
And
it evolutionary or?
did Norah tell the story to you, or you know, how is that creative process for you?
Well, I spent a lot of time working with screenplays, and in the conventional screenwriting world, the thought is you don't begin a screenplay unless you know the ending, and that the ending determines every line that precedes it. And in this case, I actually knew that I wanted Norah to be able to retrieve her father and bring him back. And so everything that occurred, the story could zigzag all over the place, but she had to get back to Rye Beach. So I knew that much. But I also knew that I was going to take her far afield, and it was going to be right at this edge of sort of, oh my God, are you kidding? That really happened? I mean, you go to Detroit and she ends up in a hospital, and this happens, and then, you know, she's abducted herself, and, you know, she becoming, so all of these things, you know, were all things that could be, and again, the story of the Odyssey, which I hope and that you've all read or it's been read to you, is, you know, widely thought to be the greatest adventure story ever told. It takes 10 years for Odysseus to get back, and all this crazy shit happens to him, you know, and it's unclear whether he really wants to get back home, because he's taking every detour he can take, and it's like, do you really want to get back home to Penelope, or do you want to just keep out here rambling around? And that's also partly what makes it a really compelling story, because it's unclear whether he's being honest that he wants to return home. In this case, Norah wants to come home. She wants to bring her father back, but the man she brings back is very different than the man that she set out to retrieve. Is that a good place to?
Yeah, we could
One
do
more?
One more, if there's a
Anybody
question
else?
out there.
By the way, you guys are like super good, you know, people that are asking.
Just a quick observation, in those passages that you read, the poet, the poet, is totally alive in this novel.
Yeah.
I mean, there are passages that are just pure lovely
Yes, absolutely.
poetry.
I'm glad that $10 I gave you might pay
That's
off,
true.
because,
Well, he's not the only one that's agreeing to that.
No, I mean-
That much money.
I mean, let's face it, I love the texture. I mean, the novels I like best, they're both plot-driven, character-driven, and they're language-driven. You really feel like you fall in love with all of those elements. And so that's what I was trying to achieve with this book, is that I couldn't drop one of those. I had to keep them all in play, but I had to make it incredible. So I thought, well, only an older woman is going to be able to have more texture to her language than, you know, and so it wouldn't be believable if a 14-year-old is talking the way this ain't the oldest of the old, because she's going to be like, you know, in her 90s at this point, looking back on this story. So, anyway, thank you for that, Michael, because that's one of my intentions.
Jane, is there
type the one more?
Well, ask Rachel.
We'll allow it.
Well, I'm not sure how to phrase it. I was just thinking, as your wife, we've talked about this, but,
Uh-oh.
How much of this was you?
all of it,
Yeah.
I'm Ruby.
No,
No,
go
but,
ahead.
no, but the fact is that, this is a time when I think about Ruby, as you talk about empowering Vera and empowering women. And you didn't really speak to that very much. I mean, Ruby sounds like she was really a woman of today, like she was in there with the men, like take me to the speakeasy, I'm not afraid of you. And same with Norah, and so you really did speak to empowering women in general. I think about that, and I really love that piece of it, with our daughters, and
Yeah,
I
so-
don't think that's something to gloss over.
Yeah, well, Ruby is definitely a new woman in every, I mean, she listens to jazz, she drinks with the boys, she, is a card shark. She's a woman of the world, but she's also this woman of the 20s, and the 20s really becomes this time when women just take on completely different roles than they've ever taken on before. And, the vote is in some way representative of that in an official way. But in another way, women were already seizing that moment. And Ruby is just this sort of emblem of that breakthrough period of time for women. And so, though she's a very questionable character with all sorts of different striations of color to her, she's a really empowered character who's really fearless.
Yeah, and I love that about it, because I think that, like you said, even a striated character, she's not afraid to step in and be something that is not, quote, acceptable,
Yeah.
like women have to be acceptable, men don't necessarily.
Right.
So, it was, to me, it was a really powerful book for young women to read, and older women to read,
These questions about character fascinate me because, I don't know if you knew a Ruby or not, and there are many other characters that you knew, but describe the experience, and I know you must have had it at one time or another, because every writer has, but you just open the door one morning and somebody's there. It's like, well, who are you? I guess I gotta do something with you because you're here. Does that ring a bell with Ruby at all?
She's a composite of various characters that
Okay.
that I've known. I mean, if you go out in the world of boats and start going to delivering boats and going into harbors and different islands and things, you meet the most colorful of all characters, right? And so, yeah, I mean, she's a composite of
Okay.
various people that I've known actually, in my life. So
Okay.
I'm grateful that I could draw her with some confidence that I was
Good.
giving her enough dimension. So thank you all for coming and for your great questions.
Somebody asked about, book on tape, and I'd like to know that
Oh.
too.
Is there an audio?
Not yet.
Are you
Okay.
thinking that way?
Well, we'll see what happens, but one hope,
Harrison Ford.
hope remains eternal. So,
I'd like to hear you read the whole
I
thing.
know.
Yeah, I think we read.
thank you. Jeez, can you come back tomorrow and say?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jay.